Hey y'all, I'm Hope, and today I want to talk about some books that I love in genres or categories that I usually don't. I've been thinking about this a little bit as I've been progressing through my master's degree because that's one of the things I found really valuable for myself in this kind of educational journey is that the classes I'm taking push me to pick up a lot of things that are outside of my usual kind of comfort zone in terms of reading and to be thinking about things I wouldn't normally be thinking about. And so not all the books I have to talk about today come from classes that I've taken. A few of them do, but not all of them do. But I've just been thinking about how that has been just really valuable for me as a reader, getting that experience of being pushed to read stuff outside of my comfort zone, and then getting to talk to people about those books and, encounter other people's thoughts and opinions on them. I just really have enjoyed that part of this program that I'm in, and I've been thinking about that a lot, so I wanted to share with you a few of my favorite books that I've read outside of my kind of usual comfort zones, which are usually like fantasy, sci-fi, horror, mystery, kind of those things, a smattering of nonfiction. That's what I read the most of, and so all of these come from many other genres and categories that I usually don't reach for, often don't enjoy when I do. I will say, small caveat, I have not read some of these in a very long time. Some of them are more recent, but some of these are from a few years ago, and so I don't remember a whole lot about some of these, so just bear with me on that one. The first category I want to talk about is memoirs. I don't really read memoirs very much at all. I have, I think, one on my shelf I want to read, and like the big ones that have come out in recent years, thinking like Spare and I'm Glad My Mom Died, things like that. I just don't really have any interest in reading them. Pardon me as I'm taking the receipt out of this book. I swear I read it. I just left the receipt in it for some reason. Usually I just don't care about memoirs at all, but I did pick up No Ashes in the Fire by Darnell L. Moore a few years ago now. I want to say it was like maybe 2020 or 2019. I think I picked this up totally on a whim because I found it on a display table at my local indie bookstore, and I just, for whatever reason, was like, hey, that sounds interesting. I'm going to pick that up and give it a shot. And I'm so glad that I did. This is one of those where I don't really remember the details of this book, but I do remember thinking this is a beautifully written memoir, and I think that it's very emotionally impactful. This one is following Darnell Moore's experiences of growing up as a gay black boy in, I think, kind of the New York, Pennsylvania, somewhere in that kind of area. I know the back says he currently lives in Brooklyn, so I think he grew up kind of around there. And it's about his experiences growing up and of being bullied, and then from there, how he got from his childhood to later becoming a writer and activist. And I just think it was a really fascinating life story. I remember that some of the portions in the later part of the book about his relationship with his mom really struck me hard and made me cry a lot. And I think this is just like beautifully written, and I remember being very engaging. So again, I don't really remember a lot of the details, but just the kind of feeling this book left me with has really stuck with me. The next genre I wanted to mention something from was romance. I really don't read a lot of romance. I do read a lot of like fantasy and sci-fi romance, and I really enjoy those, but I usually do not reach for or care about contemporary romance or historical romance or anything of that kind of variety, and it's just never really interested me. But I did end up reading The Pride of the Peacock by Victoria Holt several years ago, and I think what helped me with this one was that I didn't know it was a romance going in. I had this as like a hardback, like one of the ones, like the really old like Reader's Digest kind of hardbacks that had no description anywhere on it of like what the story was going to be, and it was just the hardback, no dust cover or anything. And I had that, and I got bored at my aunt's house one day. It was one that she had found at Goodwill, and I just picked it up kind of on a whim and started reading it, and I got invested because the story is about Jessica Clavering, who's this young woman in I want to say this is maybe like the Victorian era, maybe, possibly a little after that. I can't remember exactly the time frame. Actually, I think it's like early 1900s. But she's growing up in this family where she always has kind of felt like she didn't belong, like she wasn't really a part of the family. But she has had to deal with kind of the family drama that's come out of her family losing their home. So they had this like big manor, they were very wealthy, and had, I think they were like, had a title and everything, and then her family in some way, I don't remember how, lost their manor, and now they live on like a smaller piece of the land that was originally theirs. There's like a smaller house, and it's all of them, I think it used to be like servants' quarters or something. It's all of them living in this house together, and now the manor has been sold to this older gentleman who is coming to England to kind of retire. And she ends up meeting this older man because he's in a wheelchair and he falls down a riverbank, and she rescues him and kind of strikes up a friendship with him. I think his name is like Ben or something. And it turns out that she establishes this friendship with him, and that he knew her mother, who died many years ago, and he arranges a situation where she is set to marry his son Joss, because this man is very wealthy from opal mining in Australia, and so she kind of gets pushed into the situation where she has to marry Joss, who is the peacock of the title. So that's the setup for the story, and I really got caught up in this in the first half. The romance doesn't take place until like the later part of the book. The first part of this is very much about Jessica's relationship with Ben and the kind of friendship they strike up and the support that he gives her, this kind of like emotional support and making her feel like she is enough and that there's nothing wrong with her in a way that her family doesn't. And I really liked that kind of relationship development in the first part. So by the time we got to the romance bit and I realized what this was going to be, I was so invested in Jessica that I was like, yes, please, I want to know about this. Plus, on top of that, there's also a really fun mystery element where there is a particularly beautiful opal that's like supposedly cursed, and Ben has possession of it, and there's a lot of elements with that, and there's kind of almost like a mystery thriller element running through the whole book as well. So I thought this one was a lot of fun, and the romance almost kind of takes a backseat to everything else that's going on. It's definitely like the center of what's happening in the later parts of the book, but I just was so invested in Jessica, and I really liked her as a protagonist. I think she is very like strong-willed and I don't know, capable in a way that I wasn't expecting, and I just really enjoyed this, and it was a lot of fun. Up next, I have Mother Tongue, which I would generally consider like a coming-of-age story. I think the character in this is a little bit older. This is Mary. She's, I think, a little bit older than you would usually have in a coming-of-age story, but this story is very much about her kind of growing into herself and figuring out who she wants to be, and that is the core of the story. But Mary lives in Albuquerque with her aunt, and the two of them welcome a refugee from El Salvador who is fleeing their civil war on his way to Canada to seek asylum, in the hopes that he can also, like, while he's in Canada, kind of raise awareness of this war that's happening and try to get additional assistance for the people that have been left behind. And so she ends up meeting this guy, I think his name is Jose Luis. She ends up meeting Jose Luis, and the friendship that they kind of strike up during his time in Albuquerque helps her kind of figure out who she wants to be, because she's feeling very stuck in life. She's been kind of working at this restaurant for a long time. She's been living in Albuquerque for like her entire life, and she just doesn't really know what she wants to do or where she wants to go or who she wants to be. And he pushes her to think beyond the borders of her existing life and think about like what is possible, not what is. And I think that was just really fascinating. I really enjoyed the relationship that developed between them. This does have a romance element in it, which I thought was interesting. I wasn't expecting that the first time I read this. And I think this is just a really beautiful story, and I really liked Maria's kind of journey of figuring herself out. So this was one I read for a class when I was an undergrad, and I just really was surprised by how much I enjoyed this, because it is really not something I would normally reach for. And it kind of leads into one of the things I'm going to talk about in just a second, actually I think next, which is that this book also kind of centers on this war. It talks a lot about the Civil War that Jose Luis is fleeing from, and I usually cannot stand war books. So transitioning into the next book, put that up there. Again, I can't stand war books, especially like Civil War or either of the World Wars. Like, those are my three least favorite. I do not enjoy reading books from those time periods. I think I've also just been pushed to read too many of them from school, particularly in like high school. We had to read like All Quiet on the Western Front. I'm immediately forgetting, Night, had to read that one. So there was a lot of it in my kind of high school curriculum, and I just hated it then, I hate it now. But last year, I, for class, had to read The Fathers by Alan Tate, and this one I actually did really enjoy, surprisingly. This is about the Civil War, and it's following, I cannot remember the main character's name. I wrote a paper on this one, I can't remember it. Lacey Buchanan. Or Buchan. I think it's Lacey Buchan. Is his name on the first page? It probably is. Yes, Lacey Buchan. So this one is following Lacey Buchan during the Civil War, and it's him as an older man, well after the war, looking back on the events of the war and how his family was torn apart during the war. But it's not really so much about the war as it is about kind of the competing ideologies that his family was contending with that kind of are like a microcosm of the war. So Lacey Buchan's father, Major Buchan, is kind of like this very, you know, Old South patriarch kind of figure. And then he has a son-in-law named George Posey who marries into the family when Lacey is fairly young. And George Posey is much more like a capitalist, kind of a modern man. And it's about like the clash between them and how their differing ideologies are also kind of this microcosm of this greater conflict during the Civil War. I don't think it's a perfect book. I think that it's very clear that the author has a fondness for the Old South in a way that kind of tries to ignore the real history of the Old South. There's very little mention of slavery in here, despite it being about the Civil War. There are a couple of characters who are slaves, and I don't think that either of them is executed very well, and I would say that is like my biggest criticism of this, is that it is a vision of the South that kind of ignores the reality of the South during this time period, and of the like lasting repercussions, because this was actually written much later, in like the 1960s or something. It was much more recent. It very much is trying to like whitewash that history, and I do not like that element of it. But I was pleasantly surprised at how much I enjoyed Lacey's story and the ways that this book pitted these two men against each other without ever like villainizing either of them, which was interesting. There's not like a clear bad guy here. You just have these two men who represent very different ways of being in the world, and what you have left at the end is Lacey having to kind of reconcile both of those. More interesting than a Civil War book had any right to be, to be honest, because I just do not like stuff about wars. And I think that I enjoyed this because it didn't focus directly. The war is happening, but it's happening more in the background. It's not about the war, is I think the thing that allowed me to enjoy this a little bit more. It may have also just been a little bit of a case of Stockholm Syndrome, because I had to read it and then I had to write a paper on it. And so I just spent a lot of time reading and rereading that book, so it could be a little bit of that as well. Next up, I have a dystopian book, and I usually don't like dystopians. I read the first Hunger Games book, never finished the series, never really cared for it, didn't get into dystopian when it was kind of becoming a thing, and so I was really pleasantly surprised that I enjoyed Docile by K.M. Spera. I say enjoy, and I feel like that's a strong word for this, because this is a very difficult book. I would say that I appreciated the writing of this book. I appreciated some of the things that the author was able to accomplish here, but this book is like deeply fucked up and very difficult to read. This is a kind of dystopian future where people can sell themselves into a kind of servitude to pay off their debts, and for this purpose, there's a pharmaceutical company that's created a drug that I think it's Docilene, that allows people to go through their servitude and not remember any of it. They come out the other side, and they no longer remember any of what happened. But, I mean, there's obviously, like, room for abuse with that system, right? So, you're following two characters, one of whom is the son of, like, the guy who created Docilene, and the other one is a young man whose family has incurred a huge amount of debt. In this dystopian future, like, debt is passed on from parents to children after the parents die, and it's, like, cumulative. And so he has all of this debt from his family, and he sells himself into servitude to the son of the guy that owns the company that creates Docilene. And it's, I don't know how to explain it beyond that. It's the clash between the two of them. The main character refuses to take Docilene, Elijah. It's Elijah and Alex, I think? Or Elisha. Elisha and Alex. And Elisha refuses to take Docilene because his mother previously sold her debt, and when she came out, she never came off the Docilene. She is, like, permanently this, almost like an automaton, but a person who has been made into an automaton. She, like, repeats phrases. She doesn't do anything unless she's given something to do. And so he's refusing to take Docilene, and it's about the clash between the two of them and the ways that that relationship exposes the cracks in the system that has been created by the debt system and that has been created by the pharmaceutical company that makes Docilene. And I think it's a really interesting book. It's also interesting to me that it like changes genre partway through. If you haven't read this one, I don't want to tell you what that means because I don't want to ruin it, because it shocked me and I really enjoyed the shift in the middle of the book. If you have read it, you know exactly what I'm talking about, the way that it just like becomes a different genre in the middle. But I think this is a really fascinating book, and again, I'm really impressed with how the author was able to like write these two very different points of view, and I think, reveal some things in the, like, switches between the points of view. There's some moments in here where you'll see something that's being shown from, like, Alex's point of view, and he's, like, being, in his own mind, very reasonable about something. There's something that, like, he's like, well, I'm doing my best to make the best of the situation for both of us. You know, I think I'm being a good guy. And then you get to Elisha's point of view, and you go, oh no, that is horrific. Because now you're getting Elisha's point of view, and his kind of, from his place of, like, not having very many rights. He has 7 rights as a docile, and just, like, that shift where you're seeing the changes in things across from Alex to Elisha, and the way that worked as, like, a horror element was, I think, really brilliantly done. I have seen a lot of criticisms of this book as well, and that it doesn't engage with the history of chattel slavery in the U.S., which it certainly should, because it's set in the U.S., and there's some uncomfortable parallels there that aren't dealt with in this book. And then also, I think I've seen it kind of described as, like, torture porn. Totally see where people are coming from on that one, because it is incredibly dark, and there's some really fucked up stuff that happens to Elisha in this book. But I just think that the writing is interesting, and I'm just impressed at the kind of horror that gets worked into this book. I don't even know if that's entirely intentional, but I think it worked really well. And yeah, I'm glad I picked this one up. I totally picked it up on a whim because, again, at my indie bookstore, this is why indie bookstores are great. I was in there and I heard someone talking about this. I had seen this everywhere, and I thought, I saw this book, and, like, when you see it on the table, it says there is no consent under capitalism. I thought this was a nonfiction when I first saw it. I thought it was something about capitalism, and I'm picky about my nonfiction, so I was like, I don't want to read that. That doesn't sound interesting. Totally walked by it. I'm, like, in the indie bookstore, and I hear someone go, oh, you should read Docile, to another customer. And then she's, like, talking about it and explaining it. And I was like, oh, that does sound really interesting. I thought that was a nonfiction about capitalism. So I ended up picking it up as a result of that. And it was just a really fascinating experience. I think it is very dark, and I totally understand why this is not a book for everyone, and I do agree with a lot of the criticisms I've seen of it, but I think it's really interesting. Next up, I want to talk about literary fiction, because I am really picky when it comes to literary fiction. I usually don't enjoy it, but for the same class I read The Fathers for, I also read Salvage the Bones by Jesmyn Ward, and this book just, like, was a gut punch all the way through in a really interesting way. But this one follows a young woman, I can't remember her name, Esh. This follows Esh, who is, like, a young teenager, and she and her family have grown up in rural Mississippi, I believe it is. Mississippi, yeah. Have the right state. So Esh and her brothers have grown up kind of poor in rural Mississippi. Her mother died when she was very young, and her father has kind of done what he can to take care of the family, but he's also struggling with alcoholism, and there's just, like, a lot of things going on with their family, but they have a very close-knit friend group, and it's about her kind of childhood, and this friend group that's formed, and all of that happening as Hurricane Katrina is approaching. So this takes place in about, I think it's a week prior to Hurricane Katrina reaching land. At the same time, Esh has just found out that she is pregnant. And so it's about Esh dealing with that and kind of this shifting moment for her between kind of her the innocence of youth and this kind of push that she's experiencing, being forced into womanhood and forced into maturing faster than she should be. All while this hurricane is kind of bearing down on them, and it's unclear what's going to happen with all of that. I think it's, again, a very difficult book in a very different kind of way. Also, there's dogfighting in here, so just, like, heads up on that. I know some people in my class really didn't like the dogfighting element here. Some people had some issues with the, like, violence towards animals in this book, which, again, I totally understand with that. It didn't bother me in the same way. I think I was able to kind of separate myself from that, like, dogfighting element, but it is pretty dark and pretty gruesome at points. But I really enjoyed Esh's story, and there's also a really interesting parallel that the author has put in here. There's a particular Greek myth, and I don't want to say which one, because I think that spoils a little bit of Esh's story, if you know what it is going in. But when you read it and you find out what the story is, I think it's this really interesting through line through the story. So she is reading a Greek myth, and she's reading it on, like, a very slow timeline. She's kind of reading a couple of pages at a time. And so she's reading this myth, and her story kind of follows the through line of this myth, and it was just really fascinating, and I enjoyed that element of this book a lot. I think this is a really fascinating story, and I was really Again, with all of these, I think I've said this several times now, but I was really surprised how much I enjoyed this because it is so far removed from things I would normally pick up. I wouldn't normally be interested in Esha's story, but having been forced to pick it up for a class, I'm really grateful that I did, and I definitely want to be picking up more from Jesmyn Ward because her writing is also just beautiful in this book. Now, the very last book I have to mention, I think I've talked about a couple of times before on my channel, but this is Migratude by Shelja Patel, and this is a poetry book. And I usually do not get along with poetry. I struggle with poetry a lot. I read it and I feel stupid, and it just does not work for me most of the time. But this book really did work for me. I think this is very accessible poetry, for one thing. I think that Shelja Patel is very good at writing something that is clear what she is trying to do, and I really enjoyed the ways that she is blending a lot of different elements. The title, Migratude, comes from the combination of migrant and attitude, and this is a book about migration, forced and voluntary, and the movement of people and goods across oceans and across time, and it's just really fascinating. She's blending personal history with family history, with like national history, with global history, and I just found that blend really interesting, and the way that she ties all those elements together is really well done. I just think this is a fascinating poetry book, and it's one that I would like to come back to and reread because I think it's really engaging, and it made me like seek out information on some of the things that she's talking about. This was another one I read for class. I read this one preparing to apply for my master's degree. I was taking a class on oceanic literature, so literature of the oceans, and yeah, I was just blown away by how much I liked this. So those are 7 books that I've read from genres that I usually don't like, that I have absolutely loved, that have stuck with me in some way, and I hope that you'll consider picking up one of these, or definitely let me know down in the comments if you have books that you've read from genres you usually don't like, things that have stuck with you. I'd love to hear your answers, and I'm always looking for some good suggestions. So let me know down in the comments below if you have any books that fall into that category for you, and I really hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, I hope you'll consider giving it a like, maybe even subscribing to see what comes next. I'm currently posting every Tuesday and Saturday, so there is more content coming soon, and I hope to see you in the next video. Bye.